devise a fictional functioning propaganda system. By the end of this, you should be able to recognize how large systems produce compliance, motivation, and sacrifice at scale, and how those mechanisms can be deliberately used to your advantage in leadership and marketing contexts. We're going to use the video game Helldivers 2 as a laboratory. This isn't a lore breakdown or a moral argument about satire. It's a cognitive analysis of how propaganda operates inside a fictional system. Helldivers 2 depicts a militarized interstellar state locked in permanent war, where citizens are mobilized through ritualized patriotism, simplified enemies, and continuous calls to sacrifice. You don't need to have played this game, and you never need to play this game. The game serves as a clean, exaggerated environment where propaganda mechanisms can be isolated and examined. In Helldivers 2, players take the role of expendable soldiers deployed by a centralized government called Super Earth to fight endless alien wars in the name of managed democracy. These soldiers are framed as heroic defenders of civilization, even though they are routinely sent into strategically unfavorable situations with extreme casualty rates. This framing is reinforced through in-universe recruitment broadcasts, ceremonial language, and post-mission commendations that celebrate sacrifice while omitting survivability. With this framing in place, we're going to treat Super Earth as a governing authority and analyze the propaganda it deploys on its civilian populations, the families, the voters, the recruits, and what that propaganda does to the human brain. This analysis is grounded in two foundational works on propaganda. First, Edward Bernays in 1920 wrote, during the rise of mass media and industrial democracy, he was concerned with how large populations could be coordinated without constant coercion. In his book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, he described propaganda as the deliberate engineering of consent by influencing the group mind through collective patterns of thought and behavior, rather than persuading individuals through rational debate. His focus was on symbols, authority, repetition, and emotional framing, which was basically presenting information to elicit effective response as tools for coordinating mass behavior. Jacques Ellul, writing several decades later in the 1960s in the context of total war, mass bureaucracy, and a technologically advanced society compared to the 1920s, expanded this analysis beyond messaging. In his book, Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes, he described propaganda as a total system, one that integrates individuals, which absorbed them psychologically, into a coherent behavioral structure while preserving the subjective experience of freedom or the feeling of autonomous choice. Neither author had access to modern neuroscience, the scientific study of brain structure and function. Now, this episode adds a neuroanatomical explanation for why their observations both remain reliable. This analysis focuses on behavior rather than belief or explicit personal opinion. For you, recognizing these systems doesn't place you outside of the systems, but it does change how you move and recognize things within them. Super Earth is engaged in permanent war. The enemies change, Terminids, Automatons, Illuminate, but the conflict does not resolve. Victory is always framed as imminent, but it's never complete. Permanent war creates a specific structural problem for any state. How public consent, steady recruitment, and morale are maintained when conflict never resolves and casualties remain constant. Bernays argued that this type of problem cannot be solved through information alone, because mass publics do not coordinate behavior through rational deliberation. Arguments don't typically resolve this. Transparency or open disclosure don't solve this either. What does resolve it is psychological management, the shaping of perception, emotion, and motivation. And in this context, propaganda functions as a behavioral control system or a method for guiding action rather than a communication exercise. So here we'll start with the amygdala, which is a brain structure involved in emotional relevance and threat detection. Super Earth frames all external entities as existential threats. The enemies are portrayed as plagues, corruptions, or even abominations. The official government messaging describes these enemies as irredeemable and fundamentally hostile, leaving no cognitive room for ambiguity or coexistence. This framing keeps the civilian population in a constant state of emotional readiness or heightened alertness. Bernays emphasized emotional salience, which means the degree to which something captures attention emotionally, as a prerequisite for influence. Repeated threat framing increases amygdala responsivity. Attention becomes biased toward state-approved narratives and away from ambiguity or even dissent. When the threat perception becomes chronic or long-term, everyone's attention narrows on it. Long-range or future-oriented thinking gets weaker, and immediate alignment or rapid compliance becomes the default for everyone. This establishes the first layer of control, which is the initial behavioral leverage. Next, the prefrontal cortex, the brain regions responsible for planning, inhibition, and judgment. High emotional arousal reduces prefrontal engagement, meaning having intense affective states and use of deliberative control of your brain. Under sustained urgency or persistent time pressure, deliberation is displaced by rule following. Bernays described the shift by noting that propaganda succeeds when it bypasses individual reasoning or personal analysis and mobilizes group habits and instincts. Super Earth trains people to react instead of think ahead. Everything is framed as immediate and necessary. Mission briefings emphasize speed, sacrifice, and obedience, not long-term strategic outcomes or survival probabilities. The citizens are guided toward response or action rather than evaluation. Decision-making shifts from analysis, breaking information down, to compliance with authority cues. This is how obedience stabilizes without overt force. Now, the hippocampus, a brain structure involved in memory consolidation and familiarity. Super Earth relies on repetition, slogans, symbols, rituals, formalized repeated actions, phrases. The same phrases appear across recruitment videos, mission success screens, and civilian broadcasts, creating a continuous narrative loop. Bernays treated repetition as essential for crystallizing public opinion or stabilizing shared beliefs because it reinforces shared associations across the population over time. Repeated exposure strengthens associative memory networks. Ideas move from assertion to assumption. Familiarity reduces cognitive friction, which means the mental effort required to process information. Beliefs that feel familiar are less likely to be examined or critically questioned because they are easier to accept. This is how the extreme claims become administratively normal, treated as routine by institutions. Now, we look at the reward system of the brain. Dopaminergic pathways, brain circuits involving dopamine, a neurotransmitter tied to motivation, involved in motivation or goal-directed drives and approach behavior, moving toward valued outcomes. Super Earth prioritizes alignment over outcomes, meaning it prioritizes everyone having behavior consistent with their system goals rather than measurable results. Citizens receive praise for loyalty, sacrifice, and participation. Families are honored for offering children to the war effort. In-game commendations and honorific language celebrate participation Bernays framed identity and social role as primary levers of influence. Self concept and position within a group are mechanisms for shaping people's behavior. Dopamine here reinforces identity consistent behavior, actions matching the image that you've trained yourself to have of yourself. Actions aligned with the state acquire intrinsic reward value. They feel inherently satisfying. Success is not required for reinforcement. Loss is reframed as meaningful participation, which means it's still valued. This reframing sustains engagement even under catastrophic cost. Super Earth preserves the appearance of participation through managed democracy, controlled decision processes with superficial input. Citizens are told that algorithmic voting removes uncertainty and error, reframing control as optimization rather than coercion. The function of this system is psychological ownership of each citizen rather than choice or any actual control. Bernays argued that perceived participation increases legitimacy and compliance even when power remains centralized, meaning it's held at the top by the government. Citizens experience agency or a sense of control, while the strategic control and real decision-making power remains centralized. Frustration is redirected away from the system and the government and towards personal interpretation. Dissent begins to feel like self-betrayal rather than resistance. Compliance is maintained without persuasion. But why does this system hold together so well? System stability emerges from alignment. Emotion, memory, identity, reward, and authority all reinforce the same behavioral direction. Presence, repetition, behavioral enclosure, meaning limited alternatives, and exclusion of contradiction. Bernays explained how consent is engineered, constructed intentionally. Allul explained how individuals are integrated or absorbed into the system. Neuroanatomy explains why both frameworks converge and produce similar outcomes. These patterns reflect limits of human cognition rather than political trickery. Up to this point, we've been looking at how propaganda systems hold behavior together. It's relevant, but it's only half the picture. Because these systems don't collapse when people stop believing in them, they collapse when behavior stops lining up with what the system is asking for. Bernays assumed that consent could be engineered indefinitely if the right symbols were used, authority was clear, and repetition was maintained, while Allul warned that total propaganda could integrate people so completely that resistance would disappear altogether. They weren't wrong, but they weren't describing the limits of these systems. Every influence system has a carrying capacity, whether it admits it or not. The first place things start to fail is when sacrifice becomes too visible, too frequent, or too interchangeable. When replacement is fast enough, the loss stops feeling symbolic and starts feeling logistical. Which means Helldivers makes this uncomfortably clear. Infinite reinforcement turns heroism into a process. Death doesn't carry meaning for long when it's immediately overwritten by the next body. At that point, the nervous system stops reading sacrifice as identity confirming and starts registering it as loss that isn't being paid back. There's another pressure point that's easier to miss. Total systems depend on urgency, but urgency can't stay sharp forever. When every message is critical, every enemy is existential, and every moment demands alignment, the emotional signal starts to wash out. What follows isn't rebellion. It's more like a quiet quitting. Attention dulls, motivation flattens out, people keep showing up, but the internal pull weakens. And Allul treats this saturation as a requirement for total propaganda. What he doesn't emphasize is that saturation also accelerates exhaustion. The most dangerous failure, though, doesn't look like resistance at all. It happens when the role the system offers no longer matches lived experience of the people within it. Loyalty is praised, but doesn't get rewarded anymore. And participation is celebrated. However, survival isn't really part of the deal. When that gap opens, alignment becomes performative. Cynicism replaces belief, people continue to act, but the reward loop never quite closes. And that's how systems decay without outright revolt. Not loudly, not dramatically, but structurally. And then people most likely to trigger that decay aren't dissidents. They're leaders, managers, and institutions that keep applying influence mechanisms long after their effective range has already been exceeded. Let's shift context here. Leaders operating under pressure face a parallel structural problem, maintaining coordinated action when outcomes are delayed, uncertain, or costly. Threat framing, or defining risks, determines where attention flows. Urgency compresses deliberation, which reduces the time for analysis. Under time pressure, teams rely on heuristics or mental shortcuts, authority, and ritualized process. These mechanisms do not function independently. They are effective only when arranged deliberately in sequence to move groups from attention to alignment to action. Bernays' insight here is that leadership functions less by persuading individuals and more by shaping the conditions under which groups act. Effective systems separate deliberation phases from execution phases. Repetition installs norms or shared expectations, and repeated language, metrics, measurement standards, and rituals establish what becomes assumed. Identity reinforcement stabilizes behavior under negative outcomes. Recognition attaches reward to role-consistent action rather than results alone. Participation mechanisms, structured involvement tools like committees, surveys, feedback, create psychological ownership even when direction is fixed. Resistance decreases without debate or extended argument. Each of these dynamics mirrors the same sequence you saw earlier. Salience directs attention, urgency suppresses deliberation, repetition stabilizes norms, and identity rewards sustained alignment. And this is how you utilize these tools in effective leadership in your own processes. Now, let's consider marketing. Marketing operates upstream of leadership on the same neural systems. Salience precedes belief. Attention is captured before evaluation occurs. Bernays framed modern marketing as applied propaganda, or the use of influence techniques, using symbols and narratives like stories and imagery to guide consumer behavior without requiring conscious agreement. Think of the tenets of marketing. Repetition builds familiarity. Familiar brands require less cognitive effort to evaluate. Identity alignment supplies reward. Products function as signals of belonging, competence, or taste. The reward lies in what choosing communicates about the chooser. Let's repeat that one more time. The reward lies in what choosing communicates about the chooser. Participation without control appears as personalization, limited choice, and usage rituals. Agency, or a sense of control, is preserved by the consumer while you're guiding their behavior as the marketer. This is the same machinery operating in a different domain. Emotional salience captures attention, repetition builds familiarity, identity supplies reward, and structured choice channels action. To close, Super Earth is fictional. However, the architecture of its government systems is real enough for us to analyze. Leadership and marketing converge on these mechanisms because they act on the same nervous system. Recognizing these patterns allows detection of behavioral shaping and deliberate construction of alignment when coordination matters more than consensus. Once you understand these mechanisms, they stop being invisible and start being usable.